I'm 98 years old, and if there's one thing I wish someone had told me when I was 60, it's this: don't get a girlfriend after 60. Now, before you judge me, before you call me bitter or lonely, let me tell you something. I'm not saying this because I hate women. I'm saying this because I learned the hard way. And when you're 98 years old, you stop caring about sounding polite. You start caring about telling the truth. My name is Harold Thompson. I was born in 1927 in a small town in Ohio. Back then, life was simple. We didn't have smartphones, dating apps, or any of the chaos young people deal with today. When you met someone, you married them, and that was it. One woman, one life. I met my wife Margaret when I was 23 years old. She was standing outside a grocery store holding a bag of apples, and when she smiled at me, I felt something I had never felt before. 2 years later, we were married, and for 52 years, she was my entire world. We raised 2 children together. We built a house with our own hands. We struggled. We fought. We laughed. But we stayed together. That's what people used to do. Margaret passed away when I was 75. Cancer. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed the night before she died. She held my hand and said something that still echoes in my head. She said, "Harold, promise me you'll take care of yourself." I told her I would, but I didn't realize how hard that promise would be to keep. Because when your wife of 50 years disappears from your life, you don't just lose a person, you lose your routine, your conversations, your purpose. Your home suddenly becomes quiet, too quiet. For the first few years after she passed away, I lived alone. I tried to keep myself busy. I went fishing. I worked in my garden. I visited my children. But loneliness is a strange thing. It creeps up slowly. At first, it's just silence. Then it becomes emptiness, and one day you wake up and realize you haven't had a meaningful conversation in weeks. That's when the dangerous thoughts start. At 79 years old, I made a decision that would change the rest of my life. I decided to start dating again. Some of my friends encouraged me. They said things like, "Harold, you're still healthy. You deserve happiness. You shouldn't spend your last years alone." At the time, it sounded reasonable. So I joined a senior social group in my town. That's where I met Linda. She was 62 years old, divorced, energetic, full of life. She laughed at my jokes. She said I reminded her of the old gentleman from classic movies. And I'll be honest, it felt good. After years of loneliness, having someone interested in you feels like sunlight after a long winter. At first, everything seemed wonderful. We went to restaurants. We traveled to small towns. We watched movies together. My children were cautious, but they supported me. They said, "If she makes you happy, Dad, that's all that matters." But here's the truth no one tells you. When you start a relationship late in life, you are no longer building a life together. You are merging two completely different lives that are already fully formed. And that is much harder than people think. Linda had her habits, her expectations, her way of doing things. And after living alone for years, I had mine. Small disagreements started appearing everywhere. How the house should be organized, how money should be spent, where we should live. Things that seemed small slowly became bigger. But the real problems didn't appear until later. You see, when you're young, relationships are about growth. But when you're older, relationships are about stability. And if that stability disappears, it creates stress that your body and mind can't handle the same way anymore. Linda wanted a more active life. She wanted trips, social events, and constant activity. At 80 years old, I didn't have the same energy. Some days my knees hurt. Some days I just wanted quiet. But she saw that as rejection. Arguments became more frequent. Then came the financial issues. When you're older, money becomes a sensitive subject. Retirement savings, medical bills, inheritance for children. All of these things create tension in late life relationships. Linda started suggesting we combine finances. She wanted to move into a bigger house. She talked about starting a new chapter. But at my age, I wasn't starting a new chapter. I was protecting the final pages of my book. My children grew worried, not because they disliked her, but because they saw the stress it was causing me. At 83 years old, stress is not something you handle the same way as you did at 30. My blood pressure increased. I slept poorly. And for the first time in my life, I began feeling something I had never felt with my wife, Margaret. Exhaustion inside the relationship. Eventually, things collapsed. After 4 years together, Linda left. She said I had become distant and stubborn. Maybe she was right. But when she walked out the door, I realized something important. The loneliness I had before meeting her was peaceful. The loneliness after the relationship ended was painful, because now it came with regret. I spent years rebuilding my calm life. Years. Now I'm 98 years old, and when younger men ask me for advice, I tell them the same thing. After 60, your priorities should change. Your goal should not be chasing romance again. Your goal should be protecting your peace. Spend time with your children. Play with your grandchildren. Take care of your health. Build friendships. Travel if you can. Enjoy the quiet mornings, because peace becomes more valuable than excitement. Don't misunderstand me. Companionship is important. Friendship is wonderful. Having people around you is healthy. But jumping into a romantic relationship late in life can create complications you simply don't need. At 60, 70, or 80, your time becomes precious. Every year matters. Every peaceful day matters. And sometimes the greatest mistake older men make is trying to recreate the emotional life they had when they were young. That chapter is already written. What you should focus on instead is finishing your story with dignity and calm. I still miss my wife Margaret every day, but I've learned something. Love doesn't always need to be replaced. Sometimes it just needs to be remembered. So if you're a man over 60, listening to me right now, think carefully before you start another romantic relationship. Ask yourself one question. Are you looking for love? Or are you simply afraid of being alone? Because those two things are very different. And fear is a terrible reason to start something new. I'm 98 years old. I've lived through wars, recessions, loss, and love. And if my long life has taught me anything, it's this. Peace is the greatest luxury an old man can have. Protect it. Don't trade it away, not even for romance. When Linda left, the house felt empty again, but this time it was a different kind of empty. The silence wasn't peaceful like before. It was heavier. Because now I had something else living in that house with me. Regret. For months I kept asking myself the same question. Did I make the wrong decision? Or did I simply try to fix the wrong problem? You see, loneliness tricks your mind. It convinces you that the solution is another person. But loneliness isn't always solved by love. Sometimes it's solved by purpose. That took me years to understand. After Linda left, I was 83 years old. Most people at that age are slowing down, preparing quietly for the last chapter of life. But I had spent the previous years dealing with stress, arguments, and emotional confusion. I felt older than I actually was. And one night I sat alone in my living room, looking at an old photograph. It was a picture of my wife Margaret and me from 1965. We were standing in front of our first house. I had paint on my hands. She was laughing at something I said. And for the first time in years, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. Why was I trying to replace something that was never meant to be replaced? Margaret wasn't just a girlfriend. She wasn't just a companion. She was my life partner for more than half a century. That kind of connection isn't something you recreate at 80 years old. It's something that grows slowly over decades, through raising children, through financial struggles, through sickness and health, through the thousands of small moments that shape a life together. And that's when I realized something most older men never admit. When we start dating again late in life, We aren't actually looking for a new relationship. We're chasing a memory. We're chasing the feeling we had when we were younger. But time doesn't work that way. You can't rewind it. You can't rebuild 50 years of shared history in a few months of dating. The truth hit me slowly. I wasn't missing romance. I was missing familiarity. I was missing the quiet understanding that only comes from decades with the same person. Linda wasn't the problem. I wasn't the problem either. The real problem was expectations. We were trying to create something that life had already finished writing. After that realization, I made a decision. Instead of searching for another relationship, I decided to rebuild my life differently. I started volunteering at a local community center. At first, it was just one afternoon a week. I helped organize books in their small library. Nothing special. But something interesting happened. I started talking to people again. Not dating, just talking. Young people, middle-aged people, other seniors. I listened to their stories, and something inside me began to feel alive again. Purpose returned. That's when I learned another important lesson. Older men don't actually need romance as much as they think. What they really need is connection, conversation, feeling useful, feeling respected, feeling like their life experience still matters. One afternoon, a young man came into the community center. He was probably around 35 years old, recently divorced. He looked exhausted. He sat down across from me and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Sir, how do you deal with being alone?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Because when you're young, being alone feels like failure. But when you're old, being alone can become a form of freedom. So I told him the truth. I said, "Son, being alone isn't the hardest part of life. The hardest part is being with someone who destroys your peace." He looked surprised, but I could see that the sentence stayed with him. And that's the advice I give to men today. After 60, your life is different. Your time becomes limited. Your body becomes more fragile. Your energy becomes valuable. And the last thing you should do is introduce chaos into the final years of your life. Many men believe having a girlfriend will make them feel young again. But youth doesn't come from romance. Youth comes from curiosity, from staying active, from learning new things, from connecting with people in healthy ways. At 90 years old, I started walking every morning in the park. Not because a doctor told me to, but because I wanted to see the sunrise again. And every morning I would see the same group of older men sitting on a bench. Eventually I joined them. We talked about everything: old jobs, old memories, old mistakes. Sometimes we laughed so hard that people walking by would stare at us. That group of friends gave me something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. And the funny thing is, none of us were trying to impress anyone. No dating, no expectations, no emotional drama. Just honest friendship. That's when peace finally returned to my life. By the time I turned 92, something surprising happened. The loneliness that once terrified me disappeared. Not because I found another partner, but because I stopped fighting the stage of life I was in. Acceptance can be powerful. You stop chasing things that no longer fit your life. You start appreciating what you already have: your health, your memories, your family, your quiet mornings. And suddenly life feels lighter again. Today, at 98 years old, I spend most of my mornings sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee. Sometimes my grandchildren visit. Sometimes my neighbors stop by to talk. Sometimes it's just me and the sound of birds in the trees. And you know what? That quiet life feels richer than any late life romance ever could. Because peace is something you learn to value deeply when you get old. Young men chase excitement. Old men protect stability. And that's the biggest difference. So if you're listening to me right now and you're over 60, ask yourself this question honestly. Do you want a girlfriend, or do you want a peaceful life? Because those two things don't always go together. I learned that lesson late. But if my story saves even one man from repeating my mistake, then maybe the years I spent learning it were worth it.